because we have a very tight schedule so that you will have enough time to talk. Thank you for accepting our invitation to join the global conversation on development and conceptualization of a post-2015 global development agenda. Some of you know a lot about that, and some of you don't. We'll talk. We'll discuss the 8 topics that are on the back of your program, and you're already at your tables. You represent many different types of organizations: non-governmental, schools, academia, business, a few from the UN system, many United Nations Association members, and we expect a very rich and rewarding conversation today. We're very happy that Chris Whatley, the new Executive Director of the United Nations Association, has joined us today. And joining him are Susan Myers, Susan? Vice President for UN Relations at the UN Foundation, and Mintu Pham, wave, who is Public Policy Director of the Better World Campaign. I particularly want to thank Mark Zoller, formerly with the New York Times, who made this wonderful space available for us. Yay. And the board of the Southern New York State Division of UNA, who have been involved in planning our program. You'll meet a number of them because they are facilitating our roundtables. Thanks also to students from Adelphi University, State University of New York at New Paltz, and Marist College who have joined us. Some of them will be taking notes or writing on the flip charts. Since August 2012, the UN system has facilitated an unprecedented series of consultations with people all over the world to seek their views on a new development agenda to be built on the success of the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. That conversation responds to a growing call for active participation in shaping the world we want, 2015. And it represents an extraordinary effort to engage people from all around the world. Taking place before government representatives sit down to negotiate and finalize a new agenda, the consultations provide evidence and perspective to those representatives about the challenges people face in improving their lives and those of their families and communities. By initiating the consultations before the MDG deadline, we hope they will contribute to the efforts of UN member states to agree to an effective development framework, and that the consultations will deepen and widen national ownership of the new agenda. So we want you to go out as emissaries of this whole process. Tell your friends, tell your colleagues, get them involved. You are now part of this process. You're invited to an imaginary UN conference room to help us think critically about the future of global development. Let your voice be heard. Chris Whatley will speak about UNA and why UNA and the UN Foundation have entered into this process. Mr. Narinder Kakar, who is the permanent observer of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature to the UN, will share the background in various organizations and groups that are working toward the post-2015 development agenda. He will be followed by Carla Bachechi, who is facilitating all of the post-2015 events around the US, and she'll outline how the roundtables will function. After Carla, you will have an opportunity to view the winning videos of our middle school and high school contest on The World I Want. These will play while you serve yourselves from the buffet. The buffet will be out that door, but you'll be coming in and out and you'll have a chance to see them. We're very happy with the results of the contest. After the roundtable discussions, we'll reconvene in a plenary session so that you will have a chance to share your outcomes with everyone here. We also invite you to enter into an ongoing discussion on the division's blog and welcome your contributions. One important request. Do you each have a yellow ballot in front of you? These correspond to the ones that many of you filled out online. Because of a computer hitch, we are asking you to complete them again today, to hand them to the facilitator at your table when you finish. These data will be used along with all the other events the UNA is holding around the country. Finally, we will add your names to our mailing list, which gives information on division events, as well as events hosted by the Brooklyn, New York, Queens, and Westchester chapters. We are planning an event on human rights at the FDR Museum and Library in Hyde Park in December. And in early February, you are invited to join us at the UN at the 6th Annual Mid-Atlantic Regional Conference and UNA-USA Members Day. A few housekeeping rules. You've passed the ladies and men's rooms in the hallway before you arrived at the conference center. If you haven't found it, a coat room is around the corner, and the lunch buffet is being set up in the hallway now. Welcome to our event. Thank you. Chris.
Thank you. Thanks, Ginger. And as Ginger mentioned, I'm the new Executive Director of the United Nations Association. I'm 10 weeks into my tenure, and I've already proven that I am utterly incapable of hanging a logo on a backdrop. So, you know, I'm not off to a great start, but I would have to say that this is a fantastic time to be starting with the association, and that it's kind of a moment for our association. UNA is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year, and many of you know UNA's history, have been involved for a long time, and know its record on a whole host of fronts. But there have been limited times over the course of our association's life where we've been asked to conduct a specific body of work for the UN itself. Certainly at the moment of our founding, you know, we started in 1943, and by 1945, the original staff of UNA were bringing 42 separate organizations to San Francisco for the negotiations around the charter. In fact, Articles 68 and 71 were specifically drafted by UNA staff members. So we have this fantastic case history from the founding of the UN. We've also had some other intervening times. When the big, beautiful building, you know, over on the East River was opened, there wasn't a Department of Public Affairs or a DPI at UN at the time. And our own volunteers, it was actually the Southern New York Division, staffed it out. They had a UN Information Center on 5th Avenue, staffed by volunteers, and then they opened up similar things in storefronts all over the United States. So that was another time where the UN was specifically asking us to perform a function that was part of their agenda, not just to talk about the UN or to talk about major international issues and their multilateral implications, but to do something for the UN. And this is another one of those moments, that we are conducting a process on behalf of UNDP to actually inform one of the most important policy processes that's going on around the globe, but is desperately misunderstood and desperately underappreciated. And I just say that by way of introduction to say that what we're doing is meaningful here and unique over a 70-year arc of history of our association. So I'm just grateful for all the UNA members and leaders who've come out, but also for the students and the nonprofit partners who've come to the table. This is an important exercise and one of many that we're doing around the country. Maybe I could get the next slide there. Great. But just by way of background, most of you are well informed about the MDGs, and that makes you part of a truly unique universe, because most people don't know a thing about these. You know, it's not dinner table conversation. Maybe it is for men too. You know, she's the quarterback of our foundation's Post-2015 effort, and been involved in this world for a long time. And for us as an association, certainly we've had lots of conversations about the Millennial Development Goals and their successes. But beyond the priesthood of those who care deeply and are involved in development assistance and diplomacy, largely misunderstood or underappreciated. Next slide, please. But a lot's been achieved. You know, one of the core outcomes, cutting extreme poverty and hunger by 50%, we've gotten there. We've gotten there because of China's rise, largely. But a lot of other progress as well on malaria and infant mortality rates, lots of great things. But disappointments as well. Certainly, the climate change agenda was insufficiently addressed within the Millennial Development Goals, but you got a lot of other things that have been problems as well. Education, you know, one of the few zero targets within the original Millennial Development Goals, a lot of disappointment there. And then beyond that, if you look at the most fragile or conflict-strewn countries in the world, you generally find that they haven't hit a single MDG. So we've got a lot of challenges remaining, but the aspect of this that is most important to what we're doing here today is that last one, is the fact that beyond its influence, beyond the development agenda's influence on the major donors and in diplomatic circles, there hasn't been a sense of public buy-in or a bleed down to lower levels of government. And if we're going to do more to address some of these more complex challenges, that's going to be required. If I could get the next slide. And that's what we're engaged in, is that fundamentally we are answering a call to action of the Secretary General, who wants every member state to conduct a national grassroots consultation process. UNDP itself has conducted about 70 at this point, using their own platform, staff, and institutions. So, as we were planning this out, we were looking at how similar forums have gone in Zambia and Ukraine and in lots of different destinations around the world. And we're fulfilling that segment, that you're engaged in the official U.S. grassroots consultation process, much like counterparts of you have in 70 different countries so far. And where does this all go? I mean, fundamentally, there is a secretariat, which Min2 works with very closely at UNDP, that is quarterbacking the process of taking input, external and from member states, into the post-2015 process. We are going to take the results of this forum and our other forums we're conducting around the country. We're going to mix that with some more informal inputs that our 120 chapters around the country are doing, just in the context of UN Day events or other events that they're doing. And also at the same time, we're going to mix that with the data that we get from an effort that is happening throughout the UN Foundation to kind of drive 1 million American votes to the My World 2015 website. So we're trying to get as much and as broad of an input as possible. But in terms of a deep dive at a grassroots level, these forums, like the one that you're participating in, are our primary instrument for, in essence, focus grouping the set of issues that are on the agenda right now. Next slide, please. And in terms of where that conversation's gone, since we're here in New York, and many of you work in the industry, many of you are studying the UN itself in your coursework, you're already familiar with a lot of this. This is the results of the high-level panel report that came out over the summer. There have been other products that have come out. There are a number of themes that have already emerged from the expert conversation as to what the development assistance agenda should be beyond 2015. And when the Millennial Development Goals were created, they only had an expert conversation. But we already know, in general, some of the big themes. And those are a commitment to a set of zero targets of absolute elimination of extreme poverty and a set of other targets that are particularly compelling. A universal agenda where it would implicate policy making in developed countries across the breadth of their domestic jurisdictions, as well as informing what developed countries spend in their development assistance programs. And then the climate change agenda, the importance of conflict in institutions, other major themes. In terms of next steps, basically, we're in this kind of last phases of the canvassing process of the globe for external input. But ultimately, the UN is a club of nations, and the goals themselves will be sorted out in the diplomatic arena, and we're rapidly moving towards that next year. So we're trying to sprint to the finish and get as much of our own grassroots input in the door, in the same way that lots of individual NGOs and think tanks who have specific issue interests in the development agenda are doing the same. Next slide. And that just kind of brings us to why we're here. We're not trying to recreate the high-level panel. We're not trying to hold a think tank forum in miniature. What we want are unique conversations. And in particular, there are some specific things that I think are helpful from our own experience. First of all, it's that sense of thinking about how these universal goals, whether it's climate change or any number of things, affect domestic policy making in the United States. So that's a conversation that's yet to be had on a wide scale in the United States. It's going to be a controversial one. But it's one that makes a lot of sense to have in a grassroots conversation. And then the other thing is we've got some particular experiences that have happened domestically in the United States that intersect in interesting ways with what's going on in the expert agenda. The No Child Left Behind experience in the United States. You know, I've got a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old, and they go to one of the best elementary schools, public elementary schools in the country. It's not going to meet its zero target. We set a zero target back in 2000 that every child would read and operate in math at grade level by 2014. Even the best public school systems in Westchester or anywhere else, they're going to miss it. So how does that zero target experience intersect with an agenda where the expert audience has universally proclaimed that zero targets should be there? And is there a sense of disappointment that might come from that, or are there lessons that we can learn from our own efforts where we set a zero target and perhaps lost some of our momentum, in part because we were aiming perhaps too high? Those are all things that are unique conversations that you can have in this context that you wouldn't have at the Brookings Institution back in Washington or over in Turtle Bay itself right now. Next slide. And that's all. That's it. This is about having that universal conversation, that locally focused dive on the development agenda, but also on how this all plays out for us in our own communities and policy making going forward. And I'm grateful for all of you for being here. Thanks.
Good morning. I am very glad to be here. In fact, I feel at home. I'm a member of the Westchester chapter of UNA-USA and very proud of it. I'm not sure as to why I'm invited when other professionals, practitioners, experts like Susan Myers, Bintu, Chris Whatley, and they are here, and they've been in the thick of discussions over the last couple of years on the issue of sustainable development. Nevertheless, I'll do my best to add to what Chris Whatley has said. I would like to retrace our steps and go back a couple of years to see why we are doing this. First of all, I think we have to keep in mind that the process is a two-track process. One is the process by the General Assembly, by the member states. And the other one has been what the Secretary General has done through various modalities. He set up the panel of eminent persons and the UN Development Group, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which was headed by the very famous economist Jeffrey Sachs, and the UN Global Compact and what have you. UNDP headed or led the effort by the UN Development Group, and all these four groups submitted their recommendations to the Secretary General, and he made them part of his report to the General Assembly called A Life of Dignity for All. What we are doing here will be fed into the efforts of UNDP as part of the UN Development Group, which will in turn submit its recommendations to the Secretary General, who in turn will submit his report and recommendations to the General Assembly of the UN. That is the ultimate authority which will take the final decisions on what is to be done. So I will probably have a little more detail than what Chris has had. Could we start the slides, please? So, and I'll try to go through these slides rather quickly. Last year, as you may know, there was the Rio +20 summit, which was mandated by the UN General Assembly. Nearly 100 heads of state and government participated in it, and other governments were represented at the ministerial level. Now, the Rio +20 was mandated by a resolution of the General Assembly itself way back in 2009, 2010, if I remember correctly. And there was a concern that sustainable development, first of all, I think we should understand what sustainable development means. Some of us may not be very conversant with the definition or the meaning of it. Sustainable development was described by the Brundtland Commission. Before that, if I may say, the concept itself was invented by my organization, International Union for Conservation of Nature, way back in 1980 as part of the World Conservation Strategy, which it did in collaboration with UNEP and WWF. Sustainable development can be described as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Secondly, it is supposed to be three-dimensional. One, economically viable. Two, socially equitable. And third, environmentally sustainable. So there was a feeling in 2011, 2010 that the Commission on Sustainable Development was becoming somewhat weaker, and as a consequence, the sustainable development itself was losing some importance. And that is why Rio+20 was convened in order to get the world leaders to renew political commitment to the sustainable development concept. And the main objective was to renewed political commitment. Obviously, there were themes like green economy, institutional framework, strengthening of UNEP, and emphasis on the means of implementation, which have very often been ignored. Means of implementation, as Marcia Brewster would know, she was present in Johannesburg in 2002, referred to the four issues: one of finance, that is aid resources; secondly, technology transfer, not sale of technology; capacity building of developing countries; and trade. So we'll start from here. What did Rio+20 mandate? Eradicating poverty as the greatest challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. That comes out as the overarching objective. And then, of course, number two was somehow changing unsustainable and promoting sustainable patterns of consumption and production. And this somehow has not been getting enough attention. And I want to give you an example. The United States, with a population of 4 persons, uses nearly 30% of the world's energy. Second comes China, but in between, there's another element. If we took the building stock in the United States, just these buildings, skyscrapers and others, the building stock in itself consumes more energy than China. So, and why does it happen? Because we are obviously consuming more than we need. Mahatma Gandhi said, Earth has enough for every man's need, but not for his greed. And I think this needs to be emphasized again and again. And of course, the third one was protecting and managing the natural resource base of economic and social development. What were the recommendations? Promote inclusive and equitable economic growth, creating greater opportunities for all, reducing inequalities, raising basic standards of living, fostering equitable social development and inclusion, promoting integrated management of natural resources. How to do that? One was strengthening intergovernmental arrangements, and they set up high-level political forum. They decided to set up the forum to replace the Commission on Sustainable Development, which they thought after the CST19 meeting in June 2011, where there was no outcome document even, they thought they needed to give the responsibility for sustainable development to the highest authorities in the countries. And the high-level political forum has been set up. It met for the first time on 24th of September at the United Nations, and a number of world leaders, heads of state and government, attended that. Second decision was to set up an open working group on sustainable development goals. They felt that there was need to set up a successor arrangement for MDGs, which expire at the end of 2015. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. The thematic and cross-sectoral issues that were identified by Rio+20 started with, of course, poverty eradication, food security and nutrition, biodiversity. The previous slide, please. Biodiversity, desertification, land degradation, drought, Africa, small island states, sustainable consumption and production, it comes back here. Sustainable cities and human settlements. Then, next, water and sanitation, energy, We know about the Secretary General's initiative on sustainable energy for all, which has 3 elements, and we'll talk about it later if we have time. Gender equality and government's empowerment, promoting full and productive employment, decent work for all and social protections, oceans and seas, climate change. IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a couple of weeks ago, issued the summary of its next detailed report, which will come out in a month or 2. And their conclusion is that now it's even with greater certainty, 95% or more, that the climate change is human-induced. That is because of human actions that the climate change is getting worse. And then we come to forests. And here I'd like to make another comment related to climate change. Deforestation and land degradation contribute to about 15 to 20% of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Forests serve as sinks and they absorb emissions. So when there is deforestation and land degradation, that amount of emissions is not absorbed. Next. Now, Chris has talked a little bit about the universality of the new goals as against the MDGs. MDG 1 to 7, they were all for developing countries. MDG 8 was for developing partnership between developing countries and donor countries. But the Sustainable Development Goals, when they are developed, would be universally applicable to all countries, developing and developed, particularly because of issues like climate change, emissions, unsustainable patterns of consumption, and so on and so forth. The next please. Yeah, sorry, go back please. The Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goal, which is supposed to have 30 representatives from member states, was a little slow in starting because so many countries wanted to be on that group of 30. Eventually, they developed clusters of members. Each seat would have 2 or 3, and the members would alternate amongst themselves. There have been 4 meetings so far, and the 5th one will be on 25th to 27th November, and the theme, there are different themes for all the meetings of the Open Working Group. Food security, nutrition in the 2nd, employment, decent work, and so on and so forth in the 3rd. The very first one was on organizational matters, so that's not listed there. The next one in November would be on sustained and inclusive economic growth, macroeconomic policy questions, and so on and so forth. And then there's one in December, one in January, and February, the last one. Next, please. The high-level panel of eminent persons, as you know, was co-chaired by the presidents of Liberia and Indonesia and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. They submitted their report to the Secretary General. Now we are coming to the 4 modalities that Secretary General himself set up in order to form his own recommendations to the General Assembly, and this was the number 1. High-level panel of eminent persons, and they identified 5 big transformative shifts. Leave no one behind. Move from reducing to ending poverty. This would be very relevant for the work you would be doing now. It gives you the framework for the recommendations that should be developed. Number 2, put sustainable development at the core. Social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainability have to be integrated. 3, transform economies for jobs and inclusive growth. This has been a major issue, as you know, for the past several years. Build peace and effective, open, and accountable institutions for all. And number 5, forge a new global partnership. Now, the panel had a very elaborate consultative process while preparing their report and recommendations. And they received their inputs from a wide spectrum of stakeholders, including multilateral organizations, governments, the private sector, and over 5,000 institutions and individuals from a range of civil society organizations. And I think that is very important, to get the civil society involved, and I think that's what you're trying to do here. And I'll talk more about that aspect. Now, these were the suggested goals by the high-level panel of eminent persons: end poverty, empower girls and women and achieve gender equality, empower girls and women, and there's another one on gender equality. And I worked for UNDP for over 30 years in different countries like Yemen, Guyana, Turkey, China, South Sudan, Maldives, and a place called New York. And I was asked, if you were to select one goal or one issue to which you would put most of your resources, what would it be? And my answer was education. Within education, the education of the girl child. To me, that is extremely, extremely important. They say that if you educate a man, you are educating one person. If you educate a girl or a woman, you are educating a family. And I think that's very true, and we have to put emphasis on that aspect. Then we come to ensure healthy life, ensure food security, achieve universal access to water and sanitation, secure sustainable energy. We know about the Secretary General's initiative on that, create jobs and sustainable livelihoods, manage natural resources assets sustainably. Ensure good governance and effective institutions. This is becoming very important. I mean, within the UN system, there was a question of institutional framework and governance modalities under which now UNEP has been strengthened somewhat. More needs to be done on that. And reform of the UN system organizations also. Next, please. Now, the UN Development Group, which was headed by UNDP, conducted its own consultations. They had 88 consultations, multi-stakeholder consultations, findings in line with consultations from developing countries. Now, when they were consulting developed countries also, a Spanish NGO said we should think globally, but also act globally. We talk of think globally, act nationally, think globally. And this was a very interesting comment. Next. The UNDG report, I think I'll skip that because I don't have enough time. Then there was the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which the Secretary General set up under the leadership of Jeffrey Sachs, and it made its own recommendations, which of course can be found. I think you have the link to the report. Next, please. And STSN identified 4 societal objectives as dimensions of sustainable development: economic development, social inclusion, environmental sustainability, which are 3 dimensions of sustainable development already identified, and good governance was added to that. And they gave a list of their own recommendations. Please move on. Next. It starts with ending extreme poverty instead of just halving it, and coming to transform governance for sustainable development. UN Global Compact, they try to bring together business and investor perspectives into their recommendations to the Secretary General. Now, SG's report, A Life of Dignity for All, has given more detailed information about the MDG's performance. Chris Whatley gave some information, but if you need detailed information, the SG's report gives goal by goal performance results. Now, I'd like to talk about MDG 8, which is Global Partnership for Development. Despite pledges by donor countries, ODA from DAC countries, DAC stands for Development Assistance Committee of OECD, ODA from DAC countries fell 4% in 2012 after falling 2% in 2011. Total net ODAs from DAC countries amounted to $125 billion in 2012. We know about the target of 0.7% of gross national income to be contributed to ODA. And if we assume that that target was met by developed countries and they had contributed 0.7% of their GNI to ODA, we would have $300 billion of development aid per year in 2012 instead of 125 billion. 300 billion, and they gave 125 billion. There are recommendations of the Secretary General, which you have in his report. I like to talk lastly of the role of civil society. After Rio+20, I attended a number of events to go over what happened in Rio. And somehow, most discussions omitted the part of civil society. Civil society's participation is being given very, very high importance in the UN General Assembly and various other organs. At Rio+20, and I was there for the whole duration of 10 days, the first 3 days were devoted to the third meeting of the preparatory committee, PrepCom 3. And then there were no meetings for 4 days, and the heads of state were arriving 4 days later. Those 4 days, the Brazilian government developed a modality for holding sustainable development dialogues with the civil society on 10 different subjects. All the experts and panels for each panel were non-governmental. They were from academic institutions, research institutions, and the halls were full. The hall could take over 1,000 people, and they were full. And what were the subjects? And I think I would like to leave this with you, because this is from the civil society. Number one, sustainable development dialogue was unemployment, decent work, and migration. And the audience was asked to make recommendations as to what should go to the UN. And they, for each subject, they developed 3 recommendations. For unemployment, decent work, and migration, the 3 recommendations were: put education in the core of SDGs agenda, commit to a decent work for all by 2013, and national government should respect the human rights of all migrant workers and their families, which is also an issue in many countries. Number 2 dialogue was on sustainable development as an answer to the economic and financial crisis. The 3 recommendations coming from the audience: promote tax reforms that encourage environmental protection and benefit the poor, create a tax on international financial transactions to contribute to a green fund. This is something like the Tobin tax, which was recommended about 2 decades ago for development aid. And the 3rd recommendation was adopt shared SDGs that will also be embraced by all, by business, civil society, and the public sector. Number 3 dialogue, sustainable development for fighting poverty. Promote global education to eradicate poverty and to achieve sustainable development. Ensure universal health coverage. Promote equitable access to information. 4th dialogue was on economics of sustainable development, including sustainable patterns of production and consumption. Phase out harmful subsidies and develop green tax schemes. Include environmental damages in GNP and complement it with measures of social development. And I have a paper, a detailed paper on how we could develop a new measure, which is GDP plus, which takes other elements into account. And the 4th recommendation was promote sustainable public procurement worldwide as a catalyst. 5th was on forests, and they endorsed a target which had just been established in Hamburg early last year: restore 150 million hectares of deforested and degraded lands by 2020. Then there was food security, then there was a dialogue on sustainable energy for all, on water, on sustainable cities and innovation, and oceans. I thought this was, to me, the most important part of Rio+20, which, even though we talk about civil society participation, has not received enough attention post Rio+20. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So I'm very excited to be here because I think this is such an exciting process where you all get to actually...
You're not close enough to mine.
All right. So I'm very excited to be here because I think this is a very exciting process where there's so many people getting to include their voices in what we want to see in the next agenda. And the meetings are really about you. And I want you to have as much time as possible to discuss the issues at your table. I mean, they're big issues and you could probably be here for many hours discussing them. So I'm not going to say anymore. Each table has a moderator that will keep the conversation going. Speak your minds, speak your hearts, enjoy it, and you can get lunch now. They'll be playing the videos, and you can begin your conversations, while you're having lunch. And then we'll break at 2:15. Each table will give a short recap of what the results of their discussions were, and then we'll close. So enjoy. Thanks.
Yesterday in my political science class that we went over what the Millennium Development Goals were. Up until that point, I was like, I've never heard of this. To be honest, I think he might have been the one mentioned. It's like, there's my people don't like, it's not out there.
Well, yeah, you have to really,
Like, unless you're looking for it, not
that's the problem a lot.
it's like education. It's like the first big thing is just getting out.
Right, because they're interested in Miley Cyrus.
Or they're interested in wars going on.
Which are important too.
But like,
Of course.
But considering that there are so many other things that they, it's
A lot of
whatever
the
grabs,
wars happen.
it's whatever grabs the media's attention most is what they prefer to watch.
It's also like,
Sorry? Oh, sorry. Probably just put it in my computer.
I wrote it down in case
Yeah.
I need it again in case I don't remember.
I just figured that you would just be there.
bad guys, they're like easily digestible to certain others. Whereas things like, the lack of sustainable development, is not, how do you make that, or climate change?